In the summer of 1914, World War I was underway. Germany attacked France. Austria moved against Serbia, and the lines of battle were drawn. The attackers were the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary and Germany. The attacked and their allies were Belgium, France and England, Russia and Serbia. This was World War I. In Europe, World War I was fought principally on two fronts. A western front where Germany faced Belgium and France, and an eastern front where both Germany and Austria-Hungary confronted Russia. The war was also fought at sea and in the colonies of European countries around the world. During 4 years of unprecedented destruction, it had a profound impact on the lives of many people. The war's action began on the Western Front as the German army implemented a plan devised by former Chief of Staff Alfred von Schlieffen to attack from the northeast through the neutral country of Belgium. The plan was to encircle and capture Paris, conquering France in just a few weeks, then to move the victorious German troops eastward by railroad. There they would deal with the Russian army, led by Tsar Nicholas. That was the plan. And on August the 3rd, 1914, Germans swiftly moved through Belgium into France. Ten days later, there was equal confidence among French soldiers as they joyously re-entered Alsace-Lorraine, which Germany had occupied after the Franco-Prussian War. They would recapture these lost provinces for France, they thought. Both they and the Germans believed that the war would be short, that its outcome would be decided by 2 or 3 battles before the end of the year. But this was the world's first mechanized war, and techniques of combat had changed. The Belgians, led by their king, Albert, put up stiff resistance. But the small Belgian army could not match the powerful German force, which crunched through Belgium and into France, as Schlieffen had planned. When the invasion began, Britain declared war on Germany and sent troops to Belgium. The Germans drove southward toward Paris, the French capital, and General Joseph Joffre, the French commander, quickly prepared to meet them. He withdrew many of his troops from Alsace-Lorraine, shifting them rapidly to the region just north of Paris, where they could defend the city. French troops were brought from Paris, and so pressing was the need for transportation that many traveled in city taxicabs. The French made their stand along the Marne River, northeast of Paris. There they met the Germans, tired after their long march and weakened by several strategic errors of their commanders. General Helmut von Moltke, worried by a Russian invasion of Germany in the east, had shifted some of his units from France to that front. General Alexander von Kluck, in command of the German right wing, failed to push on and encircle Paris. The flank of his army was left open to to be struck by the French defenders. After a week of desperate struggle along the Marne, the Germans gave up the attempt to take Paris. They retreated to stronger positions in northeastern France. The war they had expected to be so short had turned into a very different kind of contest that was to last for 4 long years. A stalemate. Miles of trenches were dug on the Western Front, and for years all the major advances and retreats of both sides were limited to a distance of at most 100 miles. Day after day, soldiers of both sides fired on the enemy. Sometimes they advanced, sometimes they retreated across a blood-drenched space between opposing trenches called No Man's Land. The casualties of trench warfare were incredibly high. During the first 20 weeks of war, 750,000 Germans were wounded or killed on the Western Front. Nearly 1 million French were wounded, killed, or captured. A German soldier who was there remembered, "This was the foundation for my hardness, my resolution, and my perseverance." The soldier's name was Adolf Hitler. A young French officer who was there remarked, "War stirs in men's hearts the mud of their worst instincts. It puts a premium on violence, nourishes hatred, and gives free rein to greed." That officer's name was Charles de Gaulle. While de Gaulle, Hitler, and thousands of others struggled on the Western Front, a war that was somewhat less trench-bound was being fought on the Eastern Front and in the South. There, General Oskar Potiorek, governor of Bosnia, led the Austrian army in an attack on Serbia. The attack was quickly repelled by the well-prepared Serbian troops of Field Marshal Radomir Putnik. The proud Austrians, forced back by tiny Serbia. The German press criticized Austria, paying little attention to the fact that nearly 250,000 young Austrians had been killed or wounded. If the Central Powers had not been joined by Turkey, it is possible that Austria's position would have become much worse. As it was, the German army, already locked in conflict in the West, stood virtually alone in the East against Russia. At the beginning of the war, Russian troops under General Pavel Rennenkampf in the north and Alexander Samsonov in the south invaded East Prussia. The generals disliked each other and refused to coordinate their troops' advance. So the Germans were able to deal with the two armies separately. The Russians also blundered by having their radio operators transmit commands without using a code. The Germans knew what to expect, and they hurried to meet the Russians at the East Prussian town of Tannenberg. The Russians frantically retreated. Over 100,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, and Samsonov himself committed suicide. In Germany, credit for the Tannenberg victory was given to the elderly General Paul von Hindenburg and his chief of staff, General Erich Ludendorff. The same two men engineered the defeat of Rennenkampf's northern army at Luge. But this still did not mean victory for the Central Powers. Just another stalemate. And so 1914 ended with the armies of both sides virtually motionless. Despite the entry of Italy, Bulgaria, and others in the war, that is how matters remained, with small exchanges of territory and great losses of life until the war's end. As the war dragged on, diversionary fighting took place in Africa and in Asia. There was warfare on Turkey's Gallipoli Peninsula, a Mediterranean fortress guarding the sea route to Russia. There, British troops from Australia and New Zealand faced a Turkish force so superior in numbers and weaponry that the British were nearly wiped out, over 100,000 wounded or killed. The blame was placed on Winston Churchill, Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty, who reacted bitterly when General Monroe withdrew what was left of the British troops, saying of Monroe, "He came, he saw, he capitulated." With Gallipoli in the hands of their enemies, the Allies' only effective sea route from Europe to Asia was a southern passage around India into the Pacific. Japanese ships carried men and materiel along this route. As Britain's allies, the Japanese had declared war on the Central Powers, but had sent no troops to Europe. The most important sea route of the war was the northern corridor between Britain and her chief supplier, the United States. When war began, the American people, led by President Woodrow Wilson, clearly wanted to remain neutral. At one point, Wilson was even asked by the Germans to try to mediate a negotiated peace. But though America was neutral, her industries depended on foreign markets, and her government insisted on free trade, especially with Britain. In fact, when British funds ran low, special credit was arranged and supply ships continued to travel the northern corridor. The Germans ordered their U-boats to sink such vessels, but American protests led them to stop. Then, as the war dragged on into 1917, Germany decided that her best answer to Britain's control of the sea was unrestricted submarine warfare. In March 1917, German subs sank 4 unarmed, clearly marked American merchant ships. American feelings for war had been building. On April 2nd, President Wilson told a joint session of Congress, "The world must be made safe for democracy." And on April 6, 1917, the United States was at war on the side of the Allies. The United States was in, but at almost exactly the same time, the war-weary Russian people revolted, overthrowing Nicholas II. For a few months, a democratic Russian government tried to carry on the war. But in November 1917, they were overthrown by Lenin's communist faction, which negotiated a separate peace with the Central Powers. So, Russia was out. When the United States entered the war, no one realized that nearly 2 more years of combat lay ahead. For 20 more months, war would continue to decimate the population of Europe. War would hasten the development of weapons and of propaganda.
The other day I chanced to meet a soldier friend of mine. He'd been in camp for several weeks and he was looking fine. His muscles had developed and his cheeks were rosy red. I asked him how he liked the life and this is what he said. "Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd love to remain in bed."
Posters, newspaper ads, and songs were used to recruit replacements for the wounded and dead of Europe.
You've got to get up, you've got to get up, you've got to get up this morning. Someday
They were used to raise money for the war.
someday they're going to find him dead.
They were used to urge civilian austerity, so more supplies could be sent to the battlefields.
My life in bed.
They were used to encourage those at home to work hard to sustain the war effort.
Oh, how I'd love to remain in bed.
According to some historians, British propaganda about the inhumanity of Germans helped to bring the United States into the war. Americans joined in the stalemated conflict, and both Americans and Europeans devoted their technological skills to weapons making. At the war plants, women, the aged, and the handicapped took on traditional men's work, quickly bringing weapons into service. They made ships for combat and to carry troops and supplies. They made planes. This was the first war to be fought in the air. They made the first tanks ever used in combat. Cannon effective at longer ranges than ever before. And poison gas. And so the war was fought. For every weapon, a defense. For every defense, a counter-weapon. With such tools, the American armies went off to Europe during World War I, hoping to end the stalemate with an Allied victory. This was the state of World War I during the spring and summer of 1918.